Now let's start things off by taking a look at what Adobe Photoshop CS2 can do for you. So we'll sort of whisk our way through a sample project inside Photoshop, and you'll get a sense of just the myriad things you can do with an image editor as powerful as Photoshop. And to that end, I have two images open, the stanley.jpg and rollinghills.tiff. Now, as it turns out, I'm not encouraging you to open up these files. Later on, starting in the very next lesson, in fact, you and I are going to be working together. But for now, I'd just like you to sit back and relax and watch me at work, just to get a sense of what it is you can do. Now, if you decide later to go ahead and open up these files, try it yourself, you want to experiment along, what have you, they're both inside the Lesson 1 folder, which is inside the Part 1 folder, which is inside the Project Files folder that you should have gone ahead and installed to your hard drive. Now, I should mention that if you decide to go ahead and open up these files, at this point, you will probably see a color warning associated with each file. Just go ahead and click on the OK button. We'll come back to why those color warnings appear in the very next lesson. But as I say, you probably just want to kick back, relax, watch me at work. Now, the reason this image is called the Stanley.jpg is because this hotel way there in the background, that's the Stanley Hotel. It's in a place called Estes Park, Colorado. And I shot this image, it's sort of ratty image, frankly, out the window of a moving car. So it's not a splendid image. Didn't set up the camera on a tripod. I made no effort to make it look good while I was shooting the photograph. Sort of bad composition. But it turns out this hotel that I shot a picture of here has a history, and I'm going to zoom in on it a little bit. It's a nice old sort of, I don't know what, Victorian-style hotel. I wouldn't know such things. But it's an old hotel from the last century, or a century before that, really, in Estes Park. And it was the hotel that inspired The Shining. But you can see here, even though it is an old hotel up in the mountains, and you can imagine they get a lot of snow there, which they do, if Shelley Duvall was running away, escaping for her life, she could just go over here to, like, the Kentucky Fried Chicken or the Safeway and find somebody and they'd help her. So they're not out in the middle of nowhere. They're actually very close to a lot of other stuff, shopping malls and stuff like that. And there's even over this way, there's even like a movie theater. So she could go, spend some time seeing a movie or something. Anyway, the point is, the Stanley's not nearly so far away from town as it ought to be. Well, I want to make it appear more isolated, for one thing. I also want to fix this photograph so it doesn't look so the way Colorado really does look about this time of year, sort of gray, sort of blanched, sort of not very welcoming. I want to boost up these colors. But let's start off by putting it in the middle of nowhere where it belongs. And I'm going to do that using this image right here, Rolling Hills. Now, this image was shot in Rocky Mountain National Park, not so far away from Estes Park. And it was shot on the same day, so it has a lot of the same lighting going on. So that's going to help us. And I would like to preserve this sort of rolling hill right at the beginning of the picture here and put it in front of the Stanley instead. And I'm going to do that using a predefined selection outline that I've created in advance. Now, many of these terms will become familiar to you throughout the training series, such as selection outline, predefined selection outline, and what I'm about to say, mask. This is a mask that I've created in advance. And I'm going to get to that mask by going to the Channels palette. And notice right at the bottom of the list, dimmed in my case, is an item that's called Mask. Now, I should say, by the way, I'm working with the pre-release version of the program. So it's possible that when you're working inside Photoshop CS2, you may see a few interface items that look a little different. Don't worry about that. We should account for all differences as we're moving along here. But in my case, the mask does appear dimmed. I'm going to convert it to a selection outline to use the mask to put it in play by pressing the Control key here on the PC or the Command key on the Mac and clicking on Mask. And that goes ahead and converts this mask into a selection outline here, which allows me to modify the pixels inside the selection. For example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move these selected pixels, this selected rolling hill here. I'm going to move it into the foreground of the Stanley Hotel image. And I'm going to do that using this tool, the Move tool, in the upper right-hand corner of the toolbox. I'm going to go ahead and select that tool, which allows me to move layers and selected portions of an image. And I'm going to drag this foothills image into the background image, like so that it switches from one image window into the other. And so now I have all these trees on top of this rolling hill in front of the Stanley Hotel. Now, it's too far in front of the Stanley Hotel. So I'm going to move it downward. And notice I can keep moving these rolling hills wherever I want to just by dragging with the Move tool. Because this image, when I brought this selection into a different image window, has been converted to an independent floating layer. So I'm going to go down here to the Layers palette, and you'll see that there's now this thing called Layer 1 on top of the original background layer. Isn't that great? And what that means is this bunch of trees and this dirt and all this other stuff that's associated with the rolling hill is independent of the Stanley Hotel in back of it. So I can move the rolling hill down so it just covers up all that garbage, all that junk that was at the foreground of the image, all that shopping mall stuff, and get rid of it. Now, notice for me, it has actually clicked into place. Not in a good place here. I'll click it into a good place here. I scrolled over to the side so I can do that. So that this foreground hill lines up horizontally anyway, fills up the entire width of the image. Now, there are some problems you may note here if you take a close look at what's going on. Move this up here just a little bit. One problem is, if I zoom in on this image, one problem is that while the edges at the top of these trees, notice how great these edges are. They're pretty darn good. That shows that I took some care in creating this mask. However, regardless of how good those edges are, we have some aberrant colors, a little bit of sort of blue going on in the edges here. That's okay. More of what the problem is that these foreground trees don't match these background trees at all. It's like they're way more washed out than the background. And you can still see details of the foreground image. For example, if I move this down, you can see this is the roof of the Bank of Colorado or something like that. So we've got to cover up all this stuff. And there's some junk over here too. See, there's another roof line going right here. But the reason I'm leaving these roof lines exposed is because I don't want to end up covering up this building that's really a fundamental part of the Stanley Hotel here. So let's take care of the color problem first. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that we can take in more of the image. Then I'm going to go up to the Image menu, choose Adjustments, which reveals a long list of all the color correction commands that are available inside Photoshop. And it can be an intimidating list at first, but as we'll see, there are only a few commands that you really have to know about. And of course, we're going to spend a lot of time with those wonderful commands, the good ones. And one of the really good ones is this guy right here, Hue Saturation. And now I'm going to go ahead and choose that command to bring up this dialog box, which allows me to change the colors of this layer, of this foreground rolling hills layer. And I'm going to change the hue to 5. I'm just going to rotate the hue 5 degrees. And then I'm going to change the saturation to 30 to bump up those saturation values. And then I'm going to knock the lightness value down a bit to -10. Actually, I might take it down just a little further. -12 might work out nicely. And then I'm going to click OK in order to modify those colors. Now, this is before, radically different, and this is after, pretty darn good, pretty darn close. Not quite exactly right. And I'm going to solve this problem by using a tool. It's over here in the toolbox. If I click and hold on this little paddle, that gets me a flyout menu of editing tools. And I'm going to select the Burn tool, which allows me to darken details inside the image. And then I'm just going to drag over these trees, just little drags over these trees. And notice that each time I drag over the trees, it darkens them progressively. And I might drag over some of the dirt too here. Actually, I think this is sort of low-lying, mostly dead vegetation as opposed to dirt, just so that I'm being accurate. And so I'll get these trees nice and dark so that they more or less match their background. Now, I'm doing kind of a quick and sloppy job here, but it's working pretty well, actually. Now, I've taken care of the colors in the foreground, rolling hills, so that they match the background. What about the detail? Well, to fix the detail, I'm going to go over to this tool right here, the Clone Stamp tool, and I'm going to select it. And what this tool allows me to do is clone one portion of an image into a different portion of an image. For example, what I'm thinking of doing is cloning some of these trees over the roof of this house right here, or the bank. I guess it's a bank. And I'm going to specify which portion of the image I want to clone by sourcing the image. And I source the image by pressing the Alt key and clicking. On the Mac, that would be pressing the Option key and clicking. And don't worry too much about specifically what I'm doing once again, because we're going to look at all this stuff in rich, luxurious detail later on. And now I'm going to just kind of drag over this building. Now, this is done kind of a quasi-good job. Sort of bad, sort of good. So the good news is I went ahead and covered up that offending roof. The bad news is I've got sort of this soft, gaseous cloud of trees going. And I've cloned a bad section of trees so that we have some sort of vegetation going way high into this background area. A terrible job. So if you end up doing a terrible job, just undo it and try again. And that's what I'm going to do in this case. I'm going to also change a few settings here. Get a harder brush, maybe a little smaller. Source from a different area by once again Alt-clicking or Option-clicking on the Mac. And now I'm going to drag in this area right here. Well, this looks pretty good, actually, covering up those details pretty nicely. Maybe give it another click here to fill in some of that tree detail. And that's a nice edit. Not only does it cover up that background stuff, but it also looks credible. I believe that these trees are actually supposed to exist here. And from here on out, it's just a lot more of the same, just a lot more of using that clone stamp tool. Now, I fast-forwarded in time a little bit here so that we have a finished result. And you can see how nicely these clone trees mingle in with the original trees. Now, it turns out it's kind of a lot of work. It took about 15 minutes to get here so that these trees were nicely integrated. Lots and lots of clone stamp brushstrokes. All right, after this point, after I get the foreground and the background matching with each other, there's still some fixes I want to make to this image. For example, it's low contrast. It isn't contrasty enough. The colors are sort of desaturated. What do I do about all those things? Well, turns out I want to color correct at this point multiple layers at a time. So I need to take advantage of another color correction function inside of Photoshop, which is called an adjustment layer. To make an adjustment layer, I'm going to go down to the Layers palette here, and I'm going to click on this half black, half white icon to bring up a pop-up menu of options. And then I'm going to choose this guy right here, Levels, which is one of the best color adjustment functions in all of Photoshop. So great that we're going to spend an entire lesson on it later on down the line. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and choose this. Now, this can be kind of a daunting dialog box at the beginning, particularly because nothing about it makes all that much sense. And then there's this big sort of mountain range in the middle, which is a histogram to make things even scarier. Don't worry about that. What I'm going to do is punch up the brightness values inside this image and change the colors ever so slightly. This is going to be sort of a subtle color adjustment here. I'm going to click on this final value, 255, and I'm going to reduce it to 245. So I'm going to make the highlights, the lightest colors in the image, slightly lighter. Now, the color to me looks a little bit blue. If you take a look at it, it's a little bit cool. I want to warm it up a bit, and I'm going to do that by going to the blue channel, the stuff I want to get rid of, and I'm going to select this middle value, and I'm going to reduce this value to 0.9, from 1.00 to 0.9, and that makes the color slightly warmer. And then I'm going to click OK to accept that change. So this is before the addition of that layer. This is after. So it's a subtle adjustment layer. Well, enough subtlety already. Let's make a big color change. Let's increase the saturation of the colors. As I said, the colors are too drab inside this image. This doesn't look like a welcoming, inviting sort of haunted mansion. This looks like kind of a drab, boring place to go. So let's punch up the colors. I'm going to go back down to this black-white icon. I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to choose what is now our old friend, Hue Saturation. A different variation on Hue Saturation, but nonetheless, the same command as we saw before. And this time, I'm just going to raise those saturation values from 0 to 40. And notice what a big difference this makes. Now when I click OK, this is before that color adjustment, kind of drab colors. This is after, much punchier, more vivid colors. Now you might say, hey Deke, you went a little too far there, buddy boy. This is a little too saturated. Well, actually, it's going to work out beautifully with the final effect that we're putting together here. So go ahead and forgive these hot orange sort of earth tones here. Pay attention to the wonderful green of the shrubbery and so on. This is going to work out very, very nicely. Now, the next thing I need to do is to sharpen the focus of this image, to just sharpen up some of the details. And you've seen so far we've made some color adjustments that have applied to all layers below them. These next changes that I make can only be applied to a single layer at a time. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the very last layer in the list, the background layer, the bottom layer in the group. And I'm going to go up to the filter menu here, and I'm going to choose Sharpen, and I'm going to choose Unsharp Mask. Seems like the last command you'd want to apply, but it actually turns out to be the best command for this purpose here. And I'm going to raise the amount value to 150, and then I'm going to tab to the radius value. 1.0 is fine, 0 for the threshold is great too, and then I'm going to go ahead and click the OK button in order to apply that change. So again, it's kind of a subtle change, but this is what it looked like before, a little softer here in the background, and this is what it looks like after, a little bit sharper. If I zoom in, you can see the effect a little bit better. I'll drag it onto screen here. This is before, and this is after. So just a little bit of sharpening applied to this image. And now, in order to make everything look right, in order to make the foreground look like it belongs with the background, I need to repeat this same effect on these rolling hills here. So I'll switch to the rolling hills layer here inside the layer palette by clicking on layer 1. And then I'll go up to the filter menu and I'll choose the very first command, unsharp mask, which will reapply that last filter using those same settings again. And now this foreground area looks nice and sharp as well. And now let's take in the entire screen again. I'll move the layers palette back into place and zoom out just a little. Now, another thing you may notice about this image that's kind of wrong with it is that the sky is too sort of neutral. You know, it looks like some cloudy weather is coming in, but it's really not very dramatic. And we need a dark and stormy afternoon in this case. So I'm going to get, again, my burn tool here from the toolbox by clicking on it. And then I'm going to select the background layer at the bottom of the layers palette down here. I'm going to increase the size of my brush dramatically. And I'm just going to start painting in the sky, several brush strokes to darken up this sky and get it to look a lot stormier, a lot more dramatic. Now, we missed some of the image over here, so I'm going to scroll over to this side and darken this portion of the sky as well. Lots of little brush strokes in order to accomplish this effect, in order to achieve this stormy night. Now, I do have to be careful that I don't start dragging over the mountains too much, but I might give it a few clicks here and there just to make sure that we're shading the mountains from this dark sky of impenetrable clouds. All right, so having accomplished the dark and stormy afternoon here, what do I want to do next? Well, I want to crop this image. I want to tighten this image a little bit. After all, we're way too far back. It's delightful that we can take in the entire width of the hotel, all 4 buildings that are associated with the Stanley. And we've got all this foreground, all this background, so we can tell that it's out in the middle of nowhere, just where it belongs. But I'd like to tighten in on the hotel. After all, it is the main character of the story. And I'm going to do that by cropping this image. And I'm going to crop the image using a tool designed specifically for this purpose. This guy right here, the crop tool. I'll go ahead and click on it to select it. And now I'm going to drag from right about here to right about there. From the upper left-hand area of the image to the lower right-hand area of the image. And everything inside the marquee, this dotted boundary here, this dashed boundary of marching ants is called the marquee. Everything inside the marquee is going to stay inside the image. And everything outside the marquee in this darker area is going to go away. So once I've surrounded the portion of the image that I want to keep, I press the Enter key here on the PC or the Return key on the Mac. And there we have it, a better cropped image inside Photoshop. Allows us to focus better in on the building and still retain the foreground and background details as well. Now, at this point, this image is still a bit empty, and the reason is I've left a lot of sky because I'm going to turn this into a sort of movie poster / picture postcard that includes a big line of text in the background. And as it just so happens, thanks to the miracle of video editing, I already have this text created and ready to go. Notice down here inside the Layers palette, I have this folder called Text and Stuff. This is what makes this particular lesson so difficult to follow along with, don't you know? But right now, I've got this folder, and this folder is called a layer group inside of Photoshop CS2, a slight change in terminology from previous versions. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the group, and notice what happens. I get this big black word all over my image. Now, I really just want it to run in the background of my image, and I don't want it to be this prominent either. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to apply a layer style to this word. And this word, for what it's worth, I'll just drag it on screen so you can see it a little better. It happens to say shine, all right? We'll see it in all of its splendor in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and twirl open the group and click on this shine text layer. So this is editable text inside Photoshop. Photoshop handles text beautifully, as you might imagine. And I'm going to click on this little F icon here, this little florin icon, to bring up yet another pop-up menu. And I'll go ahead and choose the outer glow command in order to bring up the outer glow controls here inside the big old layer style dialog box. And an outer glow, if you notice back here, the text inside the image window, you can see that it has this slight, ever so slight outline going on. Well, that's no good. We need to increase that size value, more like to a value around 100 pixels. That's pretty good. So we really have some very shiny letters. And I'm also going to increase the opacity value so that the outer glow is a little brighter. And this yellow color is just fine. All the other settings are groovy. And at this point, I'll go ahead and click the OK button in order to accept that effect. Now, at this point, you might say, good gravy, Deke. I'll go ahead and press Shift-Tab in order to hide those palettes from view so we can focus on the text a little better. You might say, good gravy, Deke. You did all this work to this background imagery. You've completely mucked it up with these big letters here. They're completely covering up all that background detail. Well, not so. Not necessarily so. I can modify the opacity of the letters and the effect independently. For example, first, I'm going to reduce the opacity of the letters without changing the opacity of the text at all. And I did that by reducing the fill value inside the layers palette, but I did it from the keyboard using Shift-4 for 40% fill opacity. And don't worry about any of these details. I am just telling you in case you know what that stuff is, just what I'm up to. We're going to cover it all in tons and tons of detail later. But I was able to change the opacity of those letters independently of the shiny outer glow effect. And now bring down the opacity of both the letters and the layer effect at once by pressing the 6 key for 60% opacity. And this allows us to see through the letters, see the Stanley Hotel in the background, and still be able to read the letters just fine. So it's the best of both worlds, don't you know? Now, the next thing I want to do is bring back the mountains a little bit, mask these letters so that the letters are just popping out above this mountain ridge right here. And to do that, I'm going to press Shift-Tab once again to bring back the palettes on the right-hand side of the screen. So I'll come down here to the Layers palette, and notice at the bottom of the Layers palette, right here between the adjustment layers and the Florin icon, I've got this guy right here, which allows me to add a mask to a layer-specific mask. And I'll do that just by clicking on the icon. Now, it doesn't do anything right away. It just adds this little mask icon to the right of my text layer. And now I can brush in, paint with the paintbrush inside of this mask in order to mask the letters away. So I'll go up here to my toolbox, and I'll get the brush tool by clicking on it. Then I'm going to switch the foreground and background colors so that the foreground color is black. And then I'm just going to go ahead and brush in this mask. I've got a big fuzzy brush going here. And notice as I brush in with black into the mask, I make the letters go away. So I fade them to transparency here. Very appropriate for this image, I think, this sort of ghostly effect that I have going. And notice here, because I am working with a big fuzzy brush and because I just want these letters to fade into view, I can be a little sloppier than I could afford to be with the clone tool when I was working down here in the trees. So sometimes inside Photoshop, you have to be very, very meticulous. Other times you can afford to be a little bit sloppy, a little bit general, and things still turn out fine. Now, I have one last text layer that I've already preloaded here. I'll just go ahead and turn it on inside the Layers palette. And now let's fade away to the final layered composition that I've created here inside Photoshop. If you'd like to look at this image for yourself, it's actually there inside the Lesson 1 folder. It's called shinestanleyshine.psd, and you can open that up inside Photoshop for yourself, check out the layers. Just to give you a sense of how far we've come, here's the original image, that original flat photograph that I started with, and here is the final rendered composition as created inside Adobe Photoshop CS2.